as long as organisations have been around, they've been looking for ways to drive productivity and to get the best out of their workforce. But what we know is that human psychology and human motivation is infinitely complex, is entirely unique to each individual. And so the sum total of the centuries of development from our organisations to try and adapt to the delicacy and the subtlety of each individual essentially has led us to this. And I think sadly, although it's funny, it's sort of depressingly true. And that's what I want to speak to you about this afternoon, is to try and find ways of designing our structures and architecture in our organisation to actually do justice to the individuality of the people that sit within it. I've been studying and working in this field to try and work out, is there a motivation beyond money? Can we find a richer, deeper relationship with our employees? And that's what we're going to speak about for the next half hour. So there are two simple paradigms which exist, and the two reasons why we do anything in life. The first reason is essentially a transactional one. This is where I do things because I have to do them. What I mean by that is maybe you feel that there'll be negative consequences if I don't, therefore I'm fearful of it. Maybe I feel I've got a certain obligation, or maybe I do it because there's a reward and an incentive at play. But in other words, I'm doing it because I feel I have to. I don't really have as much free will in this. And there's a second reason. This is the transformational one, and this is the one that we're going to be speaking about this afternoon. And this is where we do things because we want to do them. And the reasons that we want to do it could be that we're interested in the subject, we feel passionately about it. It could be that we enjoy that particular topic, or quite simply, that we're committed to what it is that we're doing. And you could relate this to almost anything that you do in your lives, working life or personal life. You could take any decision and say, am I doing this because I have to do it, or because I want to do it? You're attending today. You're being sat here right now. You could look at it and say, am I choosing to be here, or do I feel a certain obligation to be here? These are the two reasons why we do things. Now, if we look at organisations in the sense of an analogy, right? Imagine that our organisations and our people within it are like an engine. For any engine to run effectively, it has to have some sort of fuel. Now, the fuel that we've used to power our engines has traditionally and historically been based on this idea of incentive or reward systems or punishment systems. And essentially this is what we've designed in our organizations, and this has been a fuel that's driven the engine, that's driven the productivity that we've seen. But increasingly, what we're seeing now is that actually that system is increasingly less effective. People are being less and less motivated to perform well through that idea of incentive and punishment. And actually the modern workforce, the younger workforce coming into our organizations today, they're running on a very different fuel. And when you talk to those people, what you find is they're actually being driven by things like a sense of values, a sense of being in an organization that they are aligned with, a sense of growth, learning, development, or a sense of satisfaction in the fact that they're doing something that's meaningful to them. And the challenge for us is, unless our organizations and the architecture of our organizations learns to manage this new fuel, learns to process this new fuel, we're going to see the engines of our organizations becoming increasingly less and less efficient. And that's the challenge for us. We have to adapt accordingly. So let's take a step back from the analogy and let's put it in practical terms so that you can see if you can identify with what it is that we're talking about here. Here's a traditional model for an organization. Okay, the space in the middle is boundaried by performance measures, by KPIs. And our expectation, therefore, is that an employee doing any particular job will need to stay within these boundaries in order to maintain their job, as it were. And what we do to keep them in those boundaries is we incentivize them through reward structures, through bonus schemes, whatever it is that your organization provides. But of course, we know that some employees maybe cross those boundaries, and so what we have to do is we have to therefore monitor where their performance is, so that when they cross those boundaries and if they enter the red area, what we've got available to us is some sort of punishment or some sort of consequence that happens. Now, the challenge with this model, despite the negative impact on motivation, is actually more profound. Because in order to maintain this model, for it to be sustainable, we actually have to do an awful lot of monitoring. We have to do a lot of observing. And what you end up with is an organization that's essentially spending a huge amount of its time monitoring, reporting, filling out documentation, having to have meetings to justify where my team are, where my performance is at. And actually, if you go and ask a lot of employees in organizations today, they will tell you that a lot of their time is not being spent doing the job that they are being paid to do, or using the skill set that they are expert in. It's actually being spent meeting the management systems that the organization requires in order to justify the fact that they're pointing in the right direction and delivering what they need. So, what's emerging right now is a different model. And this is the model that you'll be familiar with, kind of, I guess, the celebrity organizations which have those cultures that you might look enviously at. And what you'll notice about this emerging transformational model is that the area for freedom, the green area, is much, much wider in this space. And what you have in there is the boundaries are no longer KPIs and aggressive management of performance. Actually, the boundaries now become something around organizational values, as well as the kind of measurable performance standards that you would have. So what you have is people who actually stay within the boundaries because this is how we operate as an organization. These are what we believe in, and what you've got in the green space is the freedom and trust to do whatever you feel is right, as long as it's aligned to, as long as it's within the value set that we have as an organization. And of course, we're still going to give you some outcomes and some measures that you need to deliver on in your role, but these are more headline results. The how-to is slightly different. So in this model, what's driving people upwards? What's causing people to actually want to work? Well, it's that different fuel. It's that sense of purpose, the sense of growing in your role, getting more skillful, and the sense of enjoying what it is that you do. And there's another difference here that you might have noticed, which is in the boundary lines. So the boundary lines in the emerging model are not a solid block of red line. Right? The boundary lines here are actually a little bit more flexible, because actually when a member of your team crosses the boundary or perhaps enters what might be like the red area, actually what we're having here is an open discussion about why they thought that was appropriate, about what's happening in those circumstances, rather than, you know, you failed your KPI, now we're going to engage some sort of performance management system, now we're going to look to punish you. We're actually going to have much more open dialogue. And this is the emerging model. And it's a much freer model. And I came across a quote by the chief executive of Accenture, and here's what he said. The art of leadership is not to spend your time measuring and evaluating. It's about selecting the person. And if you believe you've selected the right person, then you give that person the freedom, the authority, the delegation to innovate and to lead, preferably with some very simple measures. That's what we're talking about. We spend a lot of time recruiting great people for our organizations. You've got the most highly educated, highly skilled workforce we've probably ever seen across industrial history, and somehow we're giving them the least level of trust that you could imagine. And it's really depressing for people who work in our organizations. But I do understand, you know, this is an idealistic picture, and you might be sat there very rationally thinking, yes, but in our organization, with our people, they actually do need some incentivization. You know, these bonuses are important, and without performance management, who knows what's going to happen? So these things are important. I'd like to offer you a different perspective on that. And it comes from an article that I came across a few years ago in Harvard Business School. and it's in the Harvard Business Review, and it's called Goals Gone Wild, and it looked at the impact of performance management technology, in other words, goal setting and performance appraisals, these types of things. Now, the article came to quite a strongly worded conclusion that I'm going to share with you verbatim so that you can read this. These are not my words. And I would draw your attention to the parts that I've underlined. Goal setting. Like, in other words, setting KPIs, setting management targets, this thing that's completely normal in your organizations, probably you can't imagine a world where you wouldn't do that, was seen to create a narrow focus that neglects areas that are not in that person's goals or KPIs, was seen to create a rise in unethical behavior, distorted risk preferences in order to meet those targets, a corrosion of organisational culture. In other words, causing people to act in a counter-cultural way. And finally, a reduction in intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic is what's inside me. Extrinsic is I work motivated for money and external things. So this is the two things that we're talking about today. Now, this article concluded, again, strongly worded, that rather than using goal setting as like some sort of treatment for motivation, my team member is not motivated, I'm going to prescribe goal setting, that'll get them performing well. They're actually saying you need to be really careful how you use this technology, how you use this methodology of goal setting, because it can lead to some seriously harmful side effects. They suggest it should come with a warning label. Now, this is an article in an academic paper. You might, again, read it. You might, again, think, yes, yes, but. So I would encourage you to just look in the media, literally right now. You know, last year we had Tesco, one of our leading, largest organisations, who overstated their profits by £250 million. Why would an organisation do that? Why would one of the largest, most credible, leading companies do that? You know, these aren't dishonest people who are actively trying to sort of lie and cheat, or I don't believe that's the case. You know, these are people who are desperately trying to meet targets, trying to meet the pressures of shareholder demands, of declaring things. These people are just fighting for their jobs, I imagine. And almost like a gift to my presentation, last week Volkswagen and the revelation of what's been happening in terms of emissions, they've set aside for that $7.25 billion. At present, that's what they've put to one side to cover the legal case that's going to come following this. Again, I don't believe this is a company filled with people who are lying, cheating, criminal masterminds. I think these are people who are fighting to meet the standards, the objectives that have been placed upon them for fear of their job, or for fear of what might happen in the press if their returns should be less than what was favoured. That's the problem with this. And I mean, you can track this as far back as Enron. Enron was a $63 billion case. And why did Enron collapse? Because of a bonus scheme. I mean, it was a bonus scheme that was so aggressive and so forceful that traders would do anything to get ahead of their colleagues. So all I'm suggesting is, even if part of your mind feels, yeah, we still need this a little bit, you know, we have to have respect for how damaging this traditional paradigm of goal setting, KPIs, of measurement, of performance management, incentivizing and punishing. You know, this is a high risk area to get into. And that Harvard Business School suggests you need a warning label on this. And I would question how many people in our organizations have had formal training in effective goal setting. I mean, beyond being taught SMART as an acronym, or how many people have actually considered how this behavior might end up causing unethical practices in our organizations. And you might even, if you were being honest, look at yourself and say, well, actually, do I know colleagues or companies that put some advance invoicing in for next month so that this month's figures look okay, or maybe if you're in manufacturing, put a little bit of spoilage to one side so we declare it on a month where things are a little quieter. This is normal practice, but it's not at all the culture that we want for our organisations. It's an outcome of an outdated management style that we're somehow wedded to. Okay, I'm going a bit strong maybe there, so let's back off a little bit. You might also be thinking, okay, I'm with you, Chris, that's fine, but we aren't like a Google. We don't have a young, dynamic, highly skilled, very agile workforce. You know, we're a normal company with normal employees who, in a very normal way, expect money. And to be honest, if we don't monitor their performance in a very normal way, their performance may not be up to scratch. I understand that. I just ask that you look around at what's going on in industry and just let some of these messages land on you without perhaps the cynicism that might exist. So for example, here we have Accenture, who this year announced that they are scrapping performance appraisals. A huge consulting firm making a radical decision, but they're not alone. Deloitte also scrapped performance appraisals this year. They concluded that it was wasting £200 million a year through their performance management process that they had in their organisation. £200 million a year in the UK. One company. Or maybe they're radical outliers, I don't know. The BBC head of HR said, in her opinion, appraisals don't work. 1 in 3 workers also agree that appraisals and performance management doesn't do what it's meant to do. It isn't a good use of time. Neuroscience. So these are people looking at the physical workings of our brain and how we respond, are coming to the same conclusion, that actually performance measurement and performance ranking technology is having the opposite effect to the one that we want. And we know that employees now and people coming into the workforce today are interested in more than just money. And there's more and more articles proving this and saying these type of messages. Employees are choosing employer brand over cash. In other words, who you are as a company is becoming more important than what you pay people. And there's other articles talking about how people wouldn't leave no matter how much money you paid them if they're enjoying their job, if they feel that what they're getting from their organisation is rich and fulfilling. And here's the final one from me in terms of the evidence. This one was absolutely the clincher. BBC article, is short-termism wrecking the economy? This was 20th of July, just a couple of months ago. And here's a quote by the chief economist from the Bank of England, and he said that the issue could be that management is too focused on short-term shareholder returns and prioritising cash and increasing share price in the short term, even if it's not in the company's long-term interests. You know, this is the most mainstream organisation. This is, you know, the chief economist of the Bank of England saying there is something not right about the way we're managing our organisations. So I guess my message to you is, if you are finding yourself holding on to the belief that incentivisation and punishment are necessary components for effective performance in an organisation, you need to know that the world is moving away from you. The world is moving in a different direction, and eventually you'll need to start challenging that type of mindset. So, that's my pitch to you. Is it true? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience in this area, okay? So I have a client, they're a packaging company, they are a huge organisation, global company, and for 3 years I've been working with this organisation to try and help shift their culture towards a more transformational leadership culture, towards a more engaged culture. And this is a very traditional manufacturing organisation with all of the associated challenges that you might imagine. And I want to tell you about just one site. A few years ago, they announced the closure of a small site. The news of that closure was significant in the area, and it was very sad for those people affected. And over the last couple of years, production on that site has been winding down. So what we have here is a UK-based manufacturing site where all employees are aware that their job will come to an end. Right? And that's coming to an end very soon. In upcoming few months now, that site will close. They're into the last few people now. So I've been working with the team there, and I've worked with the general manager of the site, and I asked him how it was going. And he sent me an email, and if it's okay with you, I'd just like to read this to you directly, verbatim if you wouldn't mind, about what's happened for him and his team over this last 2-year period. It says, "Hi Chris. So despite gradually winding down production here, we're still maintaining a highly engaged and highly motivated workforce." It's interesting. "Why are people performing so well despite knowing that they'll be made redundant? Well, it's not because they want to prove their European bosses wrong. In fact, few of them had ever met and certainly had no association with top management. Also, it was not because of the productivity bonus scheme that was put in place. If anything, the employees resented this scheme. Certainly they took the money, but they resented the fact that it implied that they'd not been trying hard in the past and that the bonus would somehow re-energize them. So there was a bonus scheme if production maintained till the final days, but actually it seems like that was actually more of an insult to this group. Their reason for the motivation was a sudden realization at the point of losing their jobs that they actually enjoyed their working environment. And with nobody telling them what to do, it was pure gold. Because at this point, of course, the European company's actually not that interested in what's happening. So they suddenly got a whole load of freedom. A lot of management was sort of lifted up. So in addition, it became more urgent for them to prove that they could make this product effectively before it was taken away from them and left for someone else to succeed where they could have been seen to fail. By default, we have more autonomy now to decide how to do things best. And last month, so this email was 18th of September. So I'm assuming he's referring to July this year. Last month we had 0 absence, not one person, not one day off. It seems that people do not want to be away from work. They enjoy the camaraderie so much that they don't want to miss a day of it. There is more on the email. Here's the figures he sent me. These are their current KPIs as of now. This is delivered by a group of people who are losing their jobs, who won't have a job well, in fact, maybe some of them even have left now, I mean, in a few weeks to come. So you can't stand and say money is everything to employees and that money is the only motivator. Here you have a workforce that are outstripping their equivalent peer group in other sites for the sheer love of the work, for the nostalgia of what they might lose. I've printed the email out. If after this you're interested in just reading it, just to see his own words, as I say, for me, that's the proof, right? That's what this is about. There is a richer, deeper source of motivation available than just flinging cash at people or threatening them. So what can we do? There's a few key things that make a difference in leadership terms, and this is where transformational leadership really does make a big impact. And these are the things that, if you wanted to go away from today and say, how do we start to transition? These are the 6 areas I would ask you to focus. Firstly, the relationship between the line manager and the employees. So this is my relationship with my direct boss has a huge impact on how hard I work. And think about this. If you only work for money, how many of you do longer hours than the money you were contracted to do? Right? Now, if you're not getting paid for it, why are you doing it if it's only about money? And maybe you're being threatened, in which case I'm very sad to hear that. My guess might be it's because either you love what you're doing, or you don't want to let the team down, or because you like your boss, or because you believe it's the right thing. All of these things. Line manager is massive. The nature of the day-to-day work. Don't expect people to give their best if the work that they're doing isn't going to be stimulating them. And don't think that there's some jobs which can't be made interesting. I've worked all over the world now. I've worked in 23 different countries, and I've worked in some really challenging environments. I've worked in industries where automotive manufacturing, where people had seconds to do their job. They still found it stimulating if you set up the jobs right, if you give people the freedom to have control over their work, which ties up with the freedom and trust that we're coming to later. Strength focus. If you are not familiar with Gallup's work in the strength-based leadership area, this is something that I request you go and do some research in. The research is conclusive. If you ask people to focus on their strengths, they perform exponentially better than if you ask them to try and focus on the things they're weakest at. And yet, in our performance management technologies and systems, we're asking people to fix what they're not good at, which is demotivating. And by the way, we're really unsuccessful at trying to challenge ourselves in our weak areas. So it's kind of unmotivating. You don't get much progress. Strength focus is seen to deliver huge returns. But as a company, you've got to structure yourself differently, because if someone's not good at something, stop giving it to them. If someone's not good at something, stop asking them to do it. You've got a team of people. Look for the talent. It's crazy, right? Growth and learning is something that's not just about the technical skill. The other thing we're recognizing is actually growth and learning needs to be an attitude across the whole organization. Why am I struggling so hard to get board level people into training rooms, into learning environments? Because they assume they know it all. This is not going to be a great mindset. It's not great for the culture if the idea of training is somehow you've got a deficiency in something, rather than having the humility to recognize we don't know it all, right? And we're gonna have a lot to learn in life. And people love learning when it's in areas that they're passionate about. So we need a learning culture from the senior team right through to the frontline team. We need to give people more freedom and trust. Think of that expanding green line that I showed in the presentation earlier. And finally, you need to recognize that your senior team, they are the cultural ambassadors. Their behavior is monitored, like they are being scrutinized in everything they do. And if the senior team aren't sort of living the set of values that's inspiring the workforce, again, you're going to find it incredibly hard. And you know that there's certain like celebrity leaders, the Richard Bransons of the world or the Steve Jobs, for whom just their character alone has caused the workforce to feel passionate about what they do. Your senior team play a vital role as ambassadors for this. Again, however, more often than not, they're locked away. Their decisions are seen to be rather cold, rather black and white, not taking into account the humanity of the business. So you have to really challenge the senior team as well to get on board with this. In closing, I think we have to accept that for most people, money is the reason that we work. But for very few people, if any, is money the motivator at work. And actually, if we can move away from this transactional model of incentive and punishment, there is a richer, more valuable, and by the way, far more sustainable source of human motivation available to us. And that's what organizations need to be tapping into. That's what we're working with looking forward. I mentioned Gallup earlier. They have a partnership with McKinsey. And what they said is that the global economy will be turned around, and it's going to be led by, they estimate 10 million leaders who are going to make a difference to industry. 10 million leaders who are going to change the nature of the industry. But it's not 10 million leaders running the organizations just better. It's about running it differently. And I think, for me, the differently is what we've spoken about. That's what this last half hour has been about. That's what all of the changes you're seeing is about. And we are, to some extent, part of that population. And we need to be the ones thinking differently, not just better.